For decades, the name Frank Lucas has lived in the American imagination as something dangerously close to a legend. To millions of viewers, he is remembered not as a criminal, but as a symbol, a sharply dressed outsider who climbed to the top of New York's underworld by intelligence alone, cutting out middlemen, defying the Italian mafia, and building an empire with the precision of a Fortune 500 executive. The story feels irresistible because it mirrors something deeply American: the belief that raw ambition, discipline, and nerve can overcome any system designed to keep you out. On screen, Frank Lucas doesn't just sell drugs, he sells the idea that even the darkest corners of capitalism still reward innovation. But legends are rarely born from truth alone. They are engineered, polished, and selectively edited until the blood disappears and the suffering becomes background noise. The version of Frank Lucas most people recognize was constructed to be admired, not interrogated. His rise is framed as strategic brilliance. His wealth looks earned. His violence is restrained, almost surgical. And his victims, if they appear at all, remain faceless, nameless, and silent. What audiences are invited to watch is not a crime story, but a power fantasy, carefully wrapped in the language of rebellion and self-made success. The real story begins far away from Harlem's nightclubs and tailored suits. It begins in the shadow of the Vietnam War, where American coffins returned home by the thousands, where military supply chains stretched across continents, and where corruption quietly followed the flag overseas. This is where myth and reality violently diverge. Because the real Frank Lucas did not rise against the system, he rose, because the system itself was already broken, compromised, and willing to look the other way. His drug empire did not grow in isolation. It expanded inside gaps created by war, greed, and institutional decay. This is not a story about whether Frank Lucas was clever or ruthless, both are beyond dispute. This is a story about how America chooses which criminals become monsters and which are allowed to become icons, about how cinema can transform mass destruction into personal triumph, and about what gets erased when a heroin empire is retold as a tale of style, confidence, and control. To understand the real Frank Lucas, we have to strip away the myth entirely and confront the version of the story that Hollywood never wanted to show. When audiences first met Frank Lucas through the lens of American Gangster, they weren't introduced to a drug trafficker, they were introduced to a businessman. The film carefully frames Lucas as a rational operator, someone who studies the market, identifies inefficiencies, and executes a plan with near military discipline. He cuts out middlemen, controls quality, stabilizes pricing, and reinvests profits like a seasoned executive. This is not accidental storytelling. Hollywood doesn't sell chaos, it sells control. And Frank Lucas, on screen, is all about control. The cinematic version of Frank Lucas is constructed as a direct counterweight to the Italian mafia. He is portrayed as an outsider who refuses to play by inherited rules, a man excluded by race but empowered by intelligence and audacity. This framing is crucial. It transforms a criminal enterprise into a story of meritocracy. Viewers aren't encouraged to ask whether the business itself is evil, they are encouraged to admire how efficiently it is run. In this version of events, violence exists, but it is measured, purposeful, and always framed as a response rather than an initiation. Visually, the film reinforces this myth at every level. Tailored suits, clean apartments, discreet meetings, and calculated silences replace the grime and desperation of street-level drug dealing. Harlem is not shown as a collapsing community, but as a territory being professionally managed. Even the product heroin is stripped of its consequences and reduced to a symbol of market dominance. The famous Blue Magic brand is presented less as poison and more as proof of branding genius. Perhaps most importantly, the on-screen Frank Lucas is given a moral code. He values family, punishes betrayal, and draws clear lines between business and personal loyalty. This narrative choice is deliberate. By giving him rules, the film gives him honor, and honor is what allows audiences to emotionally invest in a character whose actions would otherwise be indefensible. The result is a subtle psychological shift. the audience stops evaluating the damage caused and starts rooting for the man navigating the system. But this version of Frank Lucas only works because of what it leaves out. The film does not dwell on addiction, overdoses, or community collapse. It does not linger on the long-term destruction heroin inflicted on black neighborhoods across New York. Those stories exist off-screen, deliberately muted, because they interfere with the narrative of competence and cool authority that Hollywood wants to preserve. What emerges is not a documentary portrait, but a carefully engineered myth, one where crime is reframed as strategy, suffering is reduced to abstraction, and power becomes aspirational. This is Frank Lucas, as America prefers to see him, not as a warning, but as a mirror reflecting its own obsession with success at any cost. And that is precisely where the real story begins to diverge. Outside the glow of cinema, Frank Lucas was not a solitary mastermind standing above the underworld. He was a product of systems already in decay. His rise did not come from outsmarting a rigid order, but from exploiting a landscape fractured by war, corruption, and institutional blindness. The foundation of his real power was not charisma or elegance, but access. Access to logistics, supply chains, and people willing to betray their uniforms for profit. This is where the real story sheds its glamour and reveals its machinery. At the center of that machinery was the Vietnam War, a conflict that generated unprecedented movement of men, money, and cargo across continents. Military transport routes stretched from Southeast Asia to American cities, often with minimal oversight and maximum urgency. In this environment, accountability collapsed. Coffins returned home by the thousands, sealed, unquestioned, and treated as sacred objects no one dared inspect. The myth would later claim that Lucas alone conceived this method. The reality is colder. He stepped into a pipeline that already existed, one where oversight had failed and greed filled the vacuum. Frank Lucas did not defeat the system, he synchronized with it. His operation depended on corrupt intermediaries, compromised handlers, and a chain of silent enablers who understood that war was profitable long after the shooting stopped. Heroin flowed not because Lucas was untouchable, but because the institutions meant to stop it were unwilling or unable to look too closely. This was not rebellion, it was collaboration through neglect. The scale of his operation has also been deliberately exaggerated. Lucas later portrayed himself as the sole architect of a vertically integrated empire, controlling supply, transport, and distribution with absolute authority. In reality, the heroin trade in New York was fragmented, competitive, and violently unstable. Multiple networks operated simultaneously, overlapping, betraying one another, and constantly renegotiating territory. Lucas was significant, but he was not singular. His power existed within a crowded ecosystem of traffickers, many of whom never appeared on screen because their stories lacked cinematic appeal. What the film presents as precision was, in real life, brutality without choreography. Violence was not clean or symbolic. It was chaotic, excessive, and often pointless. Enforcement came not through calculated warnings, but through fear, random punishment, and street-level terror. Communities did not experience his rise as a tale of efficiency. They experienced it as a slow implosion, marked by addiction, crime, and the erosion of any remaining social stability. Perhaps the most revealing difference lies in motivation. On screen, Frank Lucas is driven by pride, family loyalty, and a desire to control his destiny. In reality, the driving force was scale, more product, faster movement, wider reach. There was no finish line, no moment of satisfaction, only expansion, and expansion in a heroin economy meant more bodies, more dependence, and more silence from those who benefited indirectly. Frank Lucas did not build an empire in spite of America's failures. He built it inside them. His story is not proof of individual genius overcoming adversity. It is evidence of how easily criminal power grows when war normalizes corruption and systems reward those who exploit chaos. And when that fragile alignment finally collapsed, the myth would become his most valuable asset. By the time Frank Lucas began telling his own story to journalists, prosecutors, and eventually Hollywood, one idea sat at the center of every version: control. Control of the supply, control of the streets, control of Harlem, control of the narrative. It is this image, the lone kingpin towering above chaos, that transformed him from a criminal defendant into a historical figure. But when his claims are measured against court records, federal investigations, and the testimony of rivals, that image begins to fracture. The New York heroin market of the late 1960 seconds and early 1970 seconds was not a pyramid, it was a battlefield. Power shifted constantly, alliances collapsed overnight, and dominance was temporary by design. Lucas operated inside a crowded criminal ecosystem, where Italian crews, black gangs, Caribbean distributors, and independent operators all fought for space. No single figure dictated terms for long. What Lucas called cutting out the middleman was, in reality, one strategy among many effective for a time, vulnerable the moment attention followed profit. His later insistence that he controlled the entire pipeline from Southeast Asia to Harlem served a purpose. It inflated his importance, elevated his bargaining position with authorities, and most importantly, turned his downfall into something worth filming. Absolute power makes for a compelling story. Shared power does not. The truth is that Lucas relied heavily on intermediaries, local enforcers, and fragile partnerships that could not survive sustained pressure. His empire looked vast only because the chaos around it was even larger. Even the myth of fear surrounding his name has been exaggerated. While violence was real and frequent, it did not flow from a single command center. Much of it erupted from competition, paranoia, and miscommunication, not strategic design. Dealers acted independently. Crews retaliated without permission. Killings happened that did not benefit anyone in power. This was not a chessboard. It was a market saturated with desperation, where control was claimed far more often than it was actually held. What Lucas truly mastered was not dominance, it was self-mythology. He understood that stories outlive statistics, and that memory is shaped less by documents than by repetition. By presenting himself as the architect of an empire rather than a participant in a system, he rewrote complexity into hierarchy. And once that version entered popular culture, it became harder to dislodge than any fact buried in a case file. The illusion of absolute power did something else as well. It redirected responsibility. If one man controlled everything, then one man could be blamed or admired for everything. The system disappears, the enablers fade, the failures of enforcement, policy, and oversight dissolve into the background. What remains is a single figure, standing tall enough to carry the weight of a national catastrophe alone. But no one man ever controlled what heroin did to New York. And pretending otherwise is the most dangerous myth of all. What Hollywood never slows down to show is not accidental, it is essential to preserving the myth. While the on-screen Frank Lucas moves through tailored rooms and controlled conversations, the real impact of his operation unfolded far from the camera, on streets where order collapsed quietly, day by day. Harlem did not experience an era of criminal efficiency. It experienced systemic poisoning. Heroin didn't arrive as a brand, it arrived as a slow catastrophe, eroding families, overwhelming hospitals, and turning entire blocks into revolving doors of addiction and arrest. The damage was not abstract. It showed up in overcrowded emergency rooms, schools losing students, and families watching relatives disappear without leaving the neighborhood. Addiction spread faster than institutions could respond, and enforcement focused on street-level arrests rather than the structures feeding the supply. The result was a community trapped between chemical dependence and aggressive policing, with no meaningful protection from either. This is the reality the film avoids, because it cannot coexist with the image of a calm, rational kingpin. Violence followed inevitability, not cinematic shootouts, but routine brutality, intimidation, retaliation, and fear used as daily tools of control. There was nothing surgical about it. Disputes escalated quickly. Rumors became triggers. Survival depended less on strategy than on proximity to danger. In this environment, the idea of a single mastermind orchestrating outcomes collapses. What existed instead was continuous instability, where even those profiting from the trade were never truly secure. The most enduring harm was generational. Children grew up in neighborhoods where addiction was normalized, where absence replaced stability, and where incarceration felt inevitable rather than exceptional. These consequences did not end when individual traffickers were arrested. They lingered long after headlines moved on, long after myths were written, and long after Hollywood rolled credits. The heroin economy hollowed out trust, opportunity, and safety, and then left nothing behind that could easily be rebuilt. By framing Frank Lucas as a figure of control, the film indirectly assigns chaos everywhere else. It suggests that without him, disorder would reign, when in fact, the disorder was the business model. The streets were not failing because of a lack of leadership. They were failing because profit depended on unmanaged destruction. Every dose sold deepened that collapse, regardless of how clean the supply chain appeared on paper. This is the truth that threatens the myth most. There is no way to tell Frank Lucas's story honestly without centering the communities he helped devastate. And once those voices are placed back into the narrative, admiration becomes impossible. What remains is not a legend, but a ledger, one written in lost time, broken households, and damage that no courtroom sentence ever fully accounted for. And when that reality finally began to surface, Frank Lucas would do what he did best: shift the story again, this time to survive. When Frank Lucas finally fell, it was not in a blaze of cinematic finality, but through exposure. The same systems that had once looked away began to close ranks under pressure, and the fragile alignments that sustained his operation collapsed one by one. Arrests followed, assets vanished, alliances evaporated. The empire that once appeared seamless revealed itself as conditional, dependent on silence that could no longer be guaranteed. Yet this was not the end of Frank Lucas's power. It was a transformation of it. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Lucas did something that many of his rivals could not or would not do. He adapted. Cooperation replaced defiance. Information became currency. By positioning himself as a uniquely valuable witness, he shifted from liability to asset. This decision did not erase the damage he caused, but it allowed him to survive legally, physically, and eventually, culturally. Survival, in this phase, was not about dominance on the streets. It was about relevance, and relevance is where the myth truly took shape. Once out of the immediate threat of prosecution, Lucas began to narrate himself. He refined his story, emphasizing intelligence over brutality, independence over interdependence, and strategy over chaos. Each retelling sharpened the image: the lone architect, the disciplined operator, the man who figured it out. Complexity was stripped away. Contradictions were smoothed. The system that enabled him faded into the background, replaced by a protagonist large enough to carry the entire plot alone. This self-authored version found fertile ground. Media prefers clarity to nuance. Audiences gravitate toward figures who feel exceptional rather than representative. And Hollywood, in particular, thrives on characters who can embody conflict without implicating the viewer too deeply. Frank Lucas fit perfectly. His story could be framed as personal ambition rather than collective failure, allowing institutions, policies, and long-term consequences to remain comfortably off-screen. What makes this phase unsettling is not that the myth exists, myths are inevitable, but that it proved more durable than the truth. Court documents faded, community damage became historical noise, but the image endured, repeated until it felt authoritative. In the end, Frank Lucas did not just outlive his empire, he outmanaged its memory. This is the final inversion of his story. The man who once moved product through hidden channels learned to move narrative through public ones. And just as before, The cost of that success was borne by others, by communities whose suffering never received a closing chapter, and by a culture willing to mistake survival for vindication. Frank Lucas did not escape history, he edited it. By the end of the story, the question is no longer who Frank Lucas was, it is why America chose to remember him this way. The version preserved in popular culture is not an accident of storytelling, but a reflection of deeper preferences. We are drawn to narratives of individual mastery, even when those narratives rest on collective damage. We admire control, even when that control depends on systems already broken. And we repeatedly confuse survival with legitimacy, as if living long enough grants moral clarity. The truth is harder to accept. Frank Lucas was not the embodiment of rebellion against a corrupt order. He was proof of how easily that order could be exploited when war normalized corruption, when institutions failed quietly, and when entire communities were treated as expendable. His rise did not expose a flaw in the American system, it revealed how efficiently that system could absorb destruction as long as it remained profitable and distant from power. The film version offers a clean ending, a fallen king, a closed chapter, a story with shape and restraint. Reality offers no such comfort. The damage did not end with arrests. It did not disappear with sentencing. It persisted in neighborhoods hollowed out by addiction, in families fractured beyond repair, and in policies that punished symptoms while protecting causes. Those consequences never received a soundtrack, a slow-motion exit, or a final line of dialogue. This is why separating Frank Lucas the character from Frank Lucas the man matters. One exists to be watched, the other existed to be endured, and the distance between them measures not just artistic license, but cultural responsibility. When crime is reframed as brilliance, when exploitation is repackaged as ambition, something essential is lost not from history, but from accountability. The real American gangster is not the man in the tailored suit. It is the system that allowed him to thrive, the silence that protected him, and the mythology that outlived his victims. And until those forces are confronted honestly, the story will keep repeating with new names, new faces, and the same devastating results. That is the truth Hollywood never needed, and the truth history cannot afford to forget.